2020, across England, the streets were quiet after a long night of celebration. Most families were asleep, recovering from the countdown into a brand new decade. But in the peaceful village of Duffield, Derbyshire, flashing blue lights were tearing through the darkness. This is Midnight Dark Cases. And tonight's story is one of the most disturbing domestic murder cases the country has ever seen. At around 4:28 in the morning, police arrived at a family home on New Zealand Lane after receiving a horrifying emergency call. What they found inside would stay with them forever. 39-year-old PE teacher Helen Hancock was still alive, barely breathing beside the body of her boyfriend, 48-year-old Martin Griffiths. Both had been stabbed dozens of times. Blood covered the bedroom floor, and signs of a violent struggle surrounded the room. Paramedics who responded to the scene would later describe it as one of the most horrific incidents they had ever witnessed. And perhaps the most chilling detail of all? The killer had not forced his way into the house. There were no smashed windows. No broken locks. No signs of an intruder. The man responsible already knew the property inside and out. He was Helen's estranged husband, Ree Hancock, a former headteacher and the father of her 3 children. And before the sun rose that morning, 5 children would lose a parent forever. For years, Helen and Ree Hancock had appeared to live an ordinary family life. They were married, raising 3 children together in the quiet village of Duffield, where neighbors rarely expected anything out of the ordinary. From the outside, everything seemed normal. But behind the walls of the family home, the marriage had been slowly falling apart for years. By the middle of 2019, the relationship finally collapsed. Ree moved out of the house and began staying with his mother, while Helen remained with the children and slowly started rebuilding her life. Then she met someone new. 48-year-old Martin Griffiths was a business owner and creative designer from Derby. Friends described him as adventurous, kind-hearted, and deeply devoted to his 2 children. The relationship was still relatively new, but for Helen, it represented a fresh start after years of emotional strain and instability. But when Ree Hancock discovered that Helen had moved on, investigators later believed something inside him changed completely. What had once been a painful separation quickly began turning into obsession. And the warning signs had already been there for months. Before the murders, police had reportedly been called to the family home following allegations of threats and violence involving Ree Hancock. The separation had not been peaceful. And when Ree learned that Helen was now in a relationship with another man, investigators later said his behavior became increasingly obsessive. He reportedly searched for information about Martin Griffiths, asked people questions about him, and closely monitored the relationship from a distance. What may have started as jealousy soon appeared to evolve into something far more dangerous. Friends and family would later describe a man who was struggling to accept that Helen had moved on with her life. But by New Year's Eve, the situation had escalated far beyond heartbreak. Because sometime during the early hours of January 1st, that obsession turned into a plan for murder. In the early hours of January 1st, 2020, Ree Hancock made his final decision. At his mother's home, he took 2 kitchen knives before driving nearly 10 miles through the dark roads of Derbyshire toward the house where Helen was staying. Before leaving, he reportedly told his mother that he felt like killing both Helen and Martin. Just after 4 a.m., he arrived at the property on New Zealand Lane. There was no forced entry. Ree still had a key. He quietly entered through the unlocked back door and walked upstairs toward the bedroom where Helen and Martin were sleeping. What happened next would later be described in court as brutal, savage, and merciless. The couple woke to a violent attack in the darkness of the room. Investigators later revealed that both victims suffered defensive wounds, showing they fought desperately to survive. Helen Hancock sustained 66 injuries. Martin Griffiths suffered 37. By the time emergency services arrived, Martin was already dead. Helen was still alive, but only barely. Despite desperate efforts from paramedics to save her, she died at the scene shortly afterward. Neither of them would survive the night. Just minutes after the attack, Ree Hancock called emergency services himself and confessed to the killings. When police arrived at the house, he was still there. Covered in blood, he reportedly told officers there was no point denying what he had done. Later in court, Ree Hancock pleaded guilty to the murders of Helen Hancock and Martin Griffiths. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 31 years before he could even be considered for parole. But the case left behind far more than a courtroom sentence. It shocked the country and raised serious questions about whether the warning signs leading up to the murders had been missed. Because this was not a random act of violence. Police had previously been called to the home. Threats had reportedly been made. Concerns had existed months before the attack ever happened. And for many people following the case, the most disturbing part was the belief that this tragedy may have been preventable long before New Year's Day ever arrived. 5 children lost a parent that morning. 2 families were destroyed forever. And in the quiet village of Duffield, the first sunrise of 2020 became a date that many people would never forget. This has been Midnight Dark Cases. If you enjoy real crime stories told with depth, detail, and psychological insight, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. And remember, some of the darkest crimes begin inside the safest homes.